Okay. Well, I guess it's just us. 10 people signed up for it, but maybe the time change got them. I don't know. But thank you too for coming. We'll see if anybody else comes in later. Maybe they'll all start piling in at 9 or something. I don't know. But we'll see. So we're going to be talking about divine hiddenness tonight. And I'm going to present a couple of different responses to it. First of all, Kevin, I think, had the best version of it, at least the most clear version of it. And so I'll go ahead and read his. Its premise, you'll find it in the speaker's whiteboard, by the way, which should be just above the speaker's corner. Yeah, it's the little image. You can click on that and read along if you like. Anyway, so it's premise 1. If no perfectly loving God exists, then God does not exist. That's basically definitional for at least for the Christian conception of God. Premise 2 is if a perfectly loving God exists, then there is a God who is always open to personal relationship with each human person. Premise 3, if there is a God who is always open to personal relationship with each human person, then no human person is ever non-resistantly unaware that God exists. If a perfectly loving God exists, premise 4, then no human person is ever non-resistantly unaware that God exists. And that comes from 2 and 3. Then 5, some human persons are non-resistantly unaware that God exists. 6, no perfectly loving God exists. That's from 4 and 5. And therefore 7, God does not exist. And that's from 1 and 6. And so there's a couple of responses that I would give to this argument. Is first, we want to point out that it relies on 2 intuitions. That is a way the world seems to be to us. And you can see those at premises 3 and 5. And basically the first one is that a perfectly loving God would not hide from people who are not resistant to him. And by resistant, it doesn't mean that you don't have any resistance at all. It just means like non-culpable. Like you're not responsible for not believing. These are people who are generally reasonable, sensible people that just can't find it in themselves to believe. They're just not persuaded, or it just doesn't seem to ring true to them. That's what he means by non-resistant. And so, yeah, perfectly loving God would not hide from people who are not resistant to him. He would do a Damascus experience if necessary. He would do what he would need to do in order to get them to come over that hurdle. That's the first intuition. The second one is that there are people who are non-resistant to God who nonetheless just can't seem to believe that there are people like that. And so I'd offer 2 objections to that. The first one is an undermining defeater. And it's just the case with undermining defeaters that they don't feel very satisfying. And so, for example, let's say that you had a vivid memory of a party something like 20 years ago. And you tell that memory and somebody says, no, wait a minute. That was 20 years ago. What are the odds that you remember that? And your favorite comedian, he tells that same story. That's an anecdote that he tells from the stage. Don't you think you could be misremembering? And the way you would respond to that, probably like, I guess maybe so. And you would still feel like you remember it, but you would doubt that feeling of remembering it. So that's an undermining defeater. So it doesn't feel satisfying, but nonetheless, if you think about it, it does work. And so that's the first one I'm going to present is undermining defeater. Again, it might not feel satisfying, but intellectually I hope you'll recognize that it is at least worthwhile. And the other kind is an overriding defeater, and that goes straight at the conclusion and says, it gives you a reason to reject the intuition outright rather than reject the way you're coming to believe in that intuition. So the first one is to undermine the idea that there are these non-resistant non-believers or non-culpable non-believers. The first thing we'll notice is that we basically come to believe in this non-culpable non-believer based on testimony. These are people that we've met. These are people who testify about their own experience or lack of experience of God or their own experience of unbelief. We rely on their testimony. And what we want to say then is, okay, well, if their testimony is being admitted into evidence of this irreligious testimony, if that's being admitted into evidence, well, then how can you bar religious experience from evidence, right? So if we're going to say the non-believer gets to give his testimony, well, then the believer should be able to give their testimony as well. And what we find is that there's something like 2.4 billion Christians and 500 million atheists. And so there's just a lot more people who are reasonable, sensible people who say that they have first-person experiences of God compared to the people who are atheists, who presumably, a large number of them would testify to this non-resistant non-belief. So by way of analogy, imagine that you're a journalist and you're covering a parade in New York. And as the parade's going by, you're talking to different people and trying to figure out what float they like the best. And you start hearing people say they love this peacock float. This peacock just had beautiful feathers. They just love this peacock float. And you talk to 25 people who say they saw it and they really liked the float. But then you run into 5 people who say, I didn't see any peacock float. There's no peacock float in this parade. And I was sitting right up front the whole time. If a peacock float came by, I would have seen it. So here you are, a journalist, 25 people describing roughly the same peacock float, 5 people saying they didn't see it, but they would expect that they would have. What would you do in that situation? And the reality is you would say, well, I don't know what's going on with the 5 people or why they didn't see it, but there's just overwhelming testimony from people who did. And so in the case of divine hiddenness, if I really think, which is what divine hiddenness says, that God doesn't exist if there are these people, well, then that means that their testimony of non-resistant non-belief clashes with testimony of experiences of God. They can't both be true. It can't be the case that there is no God, because there are these non-resistant non-believers, and there are people who experience God. So you have to reject one class of testimony, just like the journalist is going to have to either throw out the 25 people who say they saw this peacock float, or throw out the 5 that say that they didn't. So what would you do? And it seems like the balance of the evidence would be in favor of the religious experience. And I realize that may be unsatisfying, because it may feel like, well, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to just disregard these people and think like, well, secretly they're really belligerent about God? And I don't think you have to disregard it completely. Just like if you think God doesn't exist, you would come up with some sort of explanation or some sort of reason for thinking or accounting for people who say that they don't have experiences of God, or say that they do. You would give some account for like why it is that they're saying they have this experience and they aren't. You can do the same thing with non-resistant non-belief. And it doesn't necessarily have to be at the point of belief either. So it could be the case that some people, their mistake is in their evidentiary standards. And so by the time it comes to, do you believe in God or not, at that point, given their evidentiary standards, they're not going to find belief in God convincing. But the mistake or the culpability is in choosing evidentiary standards that are unreasonable. So for example, one that to me is obvious is the solipsist. Solipsist is somebody who believes that they're the only thing that exists. Everything else is like a mental projection, or it's an illusion that they're having. You don't exist, I don't exist, only the solipsist exists. And they don't believe in the external world, essentially. So obviously for them, it seems like there's something gone wrong in their evidentiary standards, right? If they're not taking their physical experience of the world as being evidence of the external world, then there's something wrong with their evidentiary standards. And so a person like that, maybe they don't believe in God, and when it comes to the point of their disbelief, they're reasonable, but the culpability is prior to that. Another one might be, if you've heard people say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, that's, that cashes out to be nothing more than just an anti-supernatural bias. And so that would actually be an evidentiary, culpability in the evidentiary standards. So that, when you come to evidence for God, you throw it out, but the culpability came prior to that in the evidentiary standards. Or another one might be, some people might have mutually exclusive but unjustified commitments, right? So some people might be committed to pluralism, where they think every religion is equally true. And so that's going to prevent them from accepting the truth of Christianity. Even if they have evidence for it, they're not going to really accept the truth of Christianity because they have this other commitment to pluralism. And that may be unjustified. And so maybe they're culpable for choosing to believe in pluralism, even though it's, it ends up being contradictory, and that's what's preventing them. So it's not that they're unreasonable when it comes to the point of belief, it's that they were unreasonable in accepting this other belief, like pluralism. And another reason might be like value judgments. So somebody might remain agnostic due to indecision. So it might just be that, yeah, okay, I don't really care, or I value my life, more to where it's not so much that they're saying I don't want to follow it because I want to keep living the way I am. It's just that they just have other priorities, and they have things that are just more important to them and doesn't seem critical, and so they don't feel the need to make a commitment, to make a decision, and so they might remain agnostic. And so such a person would seem reasonable. They would seem reasonable in what they're saying, but nonetheless, they're culpable because what they've done is they've not valued the issue appropriately in order to make a decision and make a commitment to one answer or the other. So there are a few different reasons how you can see how somebody would be sensible and reasonable, but nonetheless culpable for their unbelief. And again, the reason I bring that up is because when you're looking at the balance of the evidence, what are we going to do with this minority of people who say that they have this non-resistant non-belief, given that we have this majority of people who say they have a first-person experience of God? And so those are like a few different ways you might get out of it. Now, I, for one, I don't present arguments from religious experience because I don't think that my experience of God can be persuasive for you. But if you agree with that, if you think that doesn't work, well, then surely an argument from irreligious experience is just as unreasonable. It's just as unreasonable to try to argue from irreligious experience as it would be to argue from religious experience. So that would be the first undermining defeater, is that for the purposes of the argument, I think it's unjustified to claim that this non-resistant non-belief exists. Then the other objection would be an overriding believer. And this is against the idea that a perfectly loving God would not hide from non-resistant people. It may be the case that hiding from people who are not resistant to God is completely consistent with something a perfectly loving God would do. And the reason for that is that God's ultimate goal is not belief. God's ultimate goal is relationship. So it may be the case that God doesn't reveal himself because the person is in a state of mind or in a state of their life where they wouldn't respond positively. They wouldn't respond by going into a relationship with God. What comes to mind for me is Millard Erickson's account of original sin, where he says that essentially what original sin is to believe that you're a good person. That's essentially what it's getting at, is choosing right or wrong for yourself. And when you look at your sinful nature, your corrupted nature, and you think, well, I'm generally a good person, this is giving your tacit approval for what Adam and Eve did, and that's how he accounts for original sin. And that was the first thing that came to mind for this for me, is if somebody does believe that they're a good person and they come to believe in God, the result isn't somebody who is a repentant sinner who believes they need God for salvation. It could be religious pride. And so we have Jesus even accusing religious Pharisees, certainly not atheists, of unbelief. And the reason why he's accusing them of unbelief is because they believe that they're good in virtue of what they do, that they don't really need God. And so it may be the case that if somebody thinks that they're generally a good person, maybe they're a perfectly reasonable person, and they're sensible and all that sort of thing, but they believe they're a good person. And as long as they're not coming to grips with who and what they are and the sin that they do, we all, we even have this saying, nobody's perfect. It's because we all do bad things. If they're not really coming to grips to that, then coming into knowledge of God may not result in relationship. It may result in religious pride, or it may result in just a rejection of God's assessment of them as a sinner who's in need of a Savior. So it could be that. And if that's the case, then we would expect that God would hide from them until that heart issue is fixed. As long as they continue to believe that, then God might not reveal himself to them, so that he doesn't bring about a worse evil, which would be for them to know God, know that he exists, and still reject him, which would be worse than having never known that he existed at all. And in fact, it may actually be, that a perfectly loving God would intentionally hide from people like that. Because if he really loves them, and he knows that if they knew about him, then they would reject him, then it may be the case that they would have greater consequences when it comes to judgment, greater liability for their sin if he reveals himself to them. It may actually be better for them to be able to have that plausible deniability of never having known God, and so that they won't be guilty of a worse sin. And so God may, in loving them and wanting to not bring about a greater condemnation for them, he doesn't reveal himself so that they don't then become culpable for that knowledge. So those are the couple of responses I would give. The first one, the balance of the evidence and the testimony weighs in favor of religious experience over irreligious experience. And then the second one is that there are reasons why we might think that a perfectly loving God would hide from people even if they are non-resistant. So it isn't really incompatible with a perfectly loving God to do that. So if you have any questions about that, if you have any objections, any concerns, the way that you can raise your hand to come on stage, it'll unmute your mic. Down at the bottom, there's a little hand icon, a little piece of paper with some lines on it. You can click that. Excuse me, I got a bit of a cough today. I'm having to mute myself. You can click that little hand icon. That will put you in the queue. And then once I hit you, once I send you an invite, you'll have another button that flashes at the top of your screen. You click that, and that'll bring you on stage, and it'll unmute your mic. So I see that we've got Greg here. I'm going to go ahead and send you an invite, and then anybody else you can click to go into the queue.
Thank you.
Hey, Greg, how you doing?
Can you hear me just fine?
Yep, I do. Yeah, there's some kind of noise in the background, but I can still hear you okay.
Oh, sorry about that. That's probably a fan.
Oh, no problem.
Anyway, sorry, were you finishing up or?
Yeah, no, I sent you the invite because I was done.
All right, cool. I wanted to respond. So you made two counter-arguments to the divine hiddenness argument, if I understand correctly. Which is the first is kind of if we sum up or kind of almost average across the diverging testimonies of different people, that would weigh in favor of theism because plenty of people or far more people are theists. And
right.
The second being, sorry, is that
that's that's right. Yeah, I think the balance of the testimonial evidence would weigh actually against divine hiddenness.
Yes. The second was that God may have a perfectly loving God may have just reasons for hiding from particular people. I want to respond to these. The first, I think, is almost a mischaracterization, I guess, of the way that I understand the divine hiddenness argument.
Okay.
The second, I think, is at the very least it's suited to the way I would frame divine hiddenness, which is roughly that I would argue that a perfectly loving God, would want everyone to. The strong form of the argument would be a perfectly loving God would kind of contact everyone. The weaker form would be that if there's a perfectly loving God, then at least everyone would be aware of the concept of God. Now these ways of framing the argument, they're it's about if God exists, then X doesn't exist, where X is a person who's never been contacted by God or is not aware of the idea of God. So this is you can see, I think, how your Matt's first point wouldn't really necessarily be relevant here, because this doesn't require that anything about the percentage of people who are non-resistant non-believers, but it simply requires there exists someone who. Now, to
right.
The second point.
Well, let me come back on that real quick. So, but how would you know that there are such people?
Oh, I was getting to this. This is actually fun. That there are people who have either neither been contacted or not aware of the concept. The second one is actually easier to demonstrate. This is, have you ever heard of a man named Daniel Everett?
I can't say that I have. It rings a bell.
So he's a really fascinating figure. This is going to require a little bit of storytelling, if that's okay.
Okay.
He was a Christian missionary and linguist, and he traveled to meet with a kind of remote, a remote tribe in the Amazon named the Piraha people, to tell them, the good word of Jesus Christ, and to translate the Bible into their language. And what he found when he came there was not only that these people were not Christian or not theists, but they hadn't even heard of the idea of a creator God. And as an add-on to that, were not really interested in
Okay.
God. He claimed they were like empiricists to almost a radical degree,
Okay.
where like if it's outside of their experience, they just didn't even really care about it. So, and this is not the only such tribe, but I think it's a fascinating story, mostly because Everett ended up deconverting instead of winning converts. But the point is that, in my mind, the perfect example of a non-resistant non-believer is someone who couldn't even believe in it because they hadn't even heard of it. It being the idea of God. And we can see then how this would also, I think, overcome point number 2 of Matt's, which is that God may have good reasons to hide. For example, waiting until someone's heart issue is fixed. Because, in a culture like this where nobody had even heard of the idea of God, like, for God to wait, like, presumably generations of these people have died without even considering converting or even becoming theists.
Yeah. Okay. So there's there's 2 ways that I would come back on that. First is
Sorry, I'll mute.
Oh, sure. The first way I would come back is to say that the way that you've described this tribe. Now, granted, I have to confess I don't know Daniel Everett or what the story is, but just going off of what you said, the story would fall under one of the examples I gave of how somebody can, at the point of disbelief, it seems like at the point of disbelief they're reasonable, but that the unreasonable or the culpable part of it came prior, and that's in the case of, if they're radical empiricists, then they've adopted an evidentiary standard that's unreasonable, that's then preventing them from, when it comes to belief in God, of accepting it. And so a tribe like that, for me, that would fall squarely, and I wouldn't call that non-culpable non-belief. That is somebody who is culpable for their unbelief because they've adopted an unreasonable evidentiary standard that prevents them from approaching the issue in a reasonable way. And so I don't see how that wouldn't be culpable in that case, as described. And then as far as like generations of people, I think we've got a really good example actually in the Bible from the book of Job. Job, a lot of people don't know this, it's actually not a Jew. He was an Edomite. And a lot of people believe that he actually lived before Moses. And so he wouldn't have heard of Judaism. He wouldn't have heard of any of that. He nonetheless, though, God revealed himself to him. And as far as we can tell from the story, he's saved. And he's forgiven on the basis of what Jesus has done. Even though he had no idea who Jesus is, no concept of Jesus, because this is thousands of years before Jesus. But he responded positively to the revelation that he did have, just being aware there must be a God, and then he's saved. And so, if there's generations of people, we don't know if there are Jobs among those tribes. And if you think it's the case that if there is a God, then he would reveal himself directly in that way. Then, I guess we would just bite the bullet and say, I guess he could be revealing himself to people who are dying in these remote areas. And we have a story of that in Job, so it's not completely ad hoc because we have somebody like that who's completely outside of the people of God, but nonetheless did have a personal revelation of God that ultimately resulted in his salvation. So I think on both cases there, I think it would be culpable belief or culpable non-belief, and it may be the case that these people that are in these generations past actually were saved, and so obviously that wouldn't be unreasonable to them. And then the other thing with that is, if it's generally been accepted in Christianity that if somebody does have sufficient extenuating circumstances to where they wouldn't believe, like severe mental retardation or those sorts of things, we generally don't hold them responsible for their unbelief, and God doesn't either. It would be the case where they could be saved even though they didn't believe because they just had this, mental inability to believe. So if we're describing somebody that's like that, then it could be the case that they could be saved post-mortem, If I don't see any reason why in those sorts of circumstances it couldn't be the case that they would be saved that way. Because keep in mind that the Bible was written to people who would read it. It's not written to people who would never read it, and so it wouldn't describe those kinds of situations.
Yeah. I won't take up too much more time here because I want to give other people a chance to speak. I just wanted to bring up one other point in response to the unreasonable evidentiary standard. That may be true, but I think the people who aren't responsible for their own belief because they're unable to believe, I feel like that would include these kind of remote tribes. Also, the source for this, by the way, is a book called "Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes." If somebody wants to look into it more, but the other point I wanted to bring in.
Well, thank you for that. I'm now going to have trouble sleeping tonight, so thank you. Just laying in bed, I bet there are snakes.
That's the book. But anyway,
I'll let you have the last word, and then I'm going to go to Caleb.
Yeah, cool. I was just going to bring up real quick that the idea of these people have an unreasonable evidentiary standard. I'd wonder if that's true, even though it would be impossible for at least some of them, kind of who died before Everett arrived. It would be impossible for some of them to hear the word of Christ. So it kind of reminds me of that compatibilist thought experiment where it's even if you couldn't have done otherwise, are you still culpable? And that's all.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. If you do have any more comments, please do feel free to just raise the hand again, go back in the queue. Happy to talk to some more. All right, Caleb, I've sent an invite to you. There should be a button flashing. Hey, there you are.
Yeah, how you doing?
Good. How about you?
Good. Yeah. No, I thought your points were pretty good. And I guess I didn't really disagree with either of your premises. I think for the first, I forget which one was in which order, but I had a couple of things to say. I think for the first part, I forget what paper it is. I'll have to find it. But I remember reading an interesting paper saying that if you're going to grant other reasons for why God might allow horrendous evils, like for questions of theodicy, then hiddenness is kind of entailed in that, because it would be very easy to blame God personally for certain evils. Like imagine a woman being brutally mugged and raped in an alleyway, and Jesus just kind of standing there on the sidelines watching her, and she can see this. Would that negatively affect her relationship with God? Say, and we look at politicians today when people are like, why didn't you do anything? We want to blame someone else. I think that would be even more pronounced if God was, a lot more obvious. So that's kind of one thing, is there may be goods that can come about that as far as evils and that.
So you're saying that I hadn't thought about this. So you're saying that it may be the case that given people's circumstances, they would, blame God, at least in that moment, if they knew that he existed.
Yeah, and there are people who do that now who don't even have that same kind of, but I think it would be intensified even more. It would be a completely different world. I think it would be a lot worse as far as people having that kind of, you can see in a lot. I know Revelation's not the most literal book, so I hesitate to use an analogy to that. But in Revelation, when God is having all the seven seals break out on the people, they go up and they keep cursing God. It's not like they don't know it, but they're like, oh, how dare you? And they continue to hate him with gnashing of teeth and so forth. So I think that just kind of reflects that attitude. Or what about Pharaoh with the plagues in Egypt, right?
Yeah,
and that just kind of gets him more upset.
Actually, you see that almost as a consistent pattern in Scripture. There's this intuitive feeling that if you saw a miracle, you would respond positively to the miracle. But it is repeatedly throughout the Bible. So if the Bible's true, and granted, we're looking sort of as an internal critique, divine hiddenness is supposed to be, so you can draw on the resources of Christianity to answer a challenge to Christianity. And what we see is people respond. It's really a mixed bag. Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and so the religious elite, their response is, well, I guess we have to kill Lazarus too, right? You would think
I don't know if you know who Peter Atkins is. He's a chemistry professor at Oxford. He was doing an interview, it was kind of an informal debate with Hugh Ross, who's an astronomer, who's a Christian apologist. And at one point they were getting to like, well, what would convince you theoretically?
Yeah.
And Justin Briley asked him, so like, Peter, if the stars in the sky aligned and say, Peter, please believe in me, love God, would you believe in it? And Peter was like, well, I would probably just say I've had a hallucination at that point, but I'm completely senile and crazy.
Yeah.
And granted, like people like Schellenberg would say, well, that's just resistant to belief. It would be unreasonable. But I like what you said about standards of evidence and testimony, because I think that's a good point. And I think the idea that we all should be able to see a miracle on command, or that God is obligated to provide miracles to each person, is unreasonable. And I think that there's a lot of good in trusting people, and that having faith and testimony in general, not all the time, but that's a good that can be derived. Whereas if we could experience everything for ourselves whenever we wanted to, we wouldn't really need to trust people, and that would be a worse world overall. And as far as like standards of evidence, the work I'm doing right now is actually on like modern miracle claims, and I just think that in my mind, that's kind of persuade me that I think God will be willing to convert people who are sincere. And you get this when he brought up the Pariah people of Brazil. Although it is true they don't believe in a God, although they do actually still believe in spirits and kind of ghosts. So they're not like a naturalistic tribe, at least. They're more like animists kind of. But granted, they don't believe in like a creator God. But I hear all kinds of testimonies, and there are accounts. Some of them are pretty well documented, of people who have never even heard of Christianity, like Hindus or Muslims, who will have Jesus appear to them in a vision or a dream, and then that'll lead them to a missionary. And so if one believes that actually is legitimate, then this means that God can provide avenues even of people who've never heard before. The most interesting example to me is an example from the 17th century that's pretty well documented, like from primary sources at the time, of a woman named Maria de Agreda, and you can look this up. She was a Franciscan nun from Spain. She was doing meditations and stuff, but while this was happening, the Spanish were exploring the New World about New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, that kind of region, the early 1600s. And while they were setting up missionaries and stuff there, the tribes people there came to them and said, we want to be baptized and be converted. And the missionaries were surprised, because they hadn't even started yet. They're like, we're just setting up camp. Like, I mean, that's great that you want to convert, but why? And they're like, well, we've actually seen this, and they pointed to a painting of one of the nuns. They said, there's a woman who looks like that. The face isn't the same, but she's wearing that outfit, and she's come to us many times and spoken to us in our own language and communicated us and told us the gospel, and this is exciting. We want to convert. And of course, no nuns had joined them, so they were confused. But back in Spain, we have the testimony of Maria de Agreda, who was having visions of seeing herself in the New World and talking and evangelizing to these missionaries. So we have the letters at the time written by the missionaries in Spain, and we independently have the accounts of the Inquisition going on in Spain. So you basically have this woman saying that God is kind of biolocating her to the New World, and she's able to describe all this stuff and do it. So you have these two accounts kind of corroborate. But that just goes to show that God can do amazing ways of getting to people who really want to. And so I think if we have to take those two things, we just say, okay, which is easier to explain? Someone who says, I don't believe, or I'm not convinced, and I'm not resistant. Okay, we have their testimony to go off of this. What explanations could it be if they're wrong? Well, maybe they're just subconsciously repressing it. They don't know it. It's possible. Maybe they're lying. That's probably less likely. And then we have all these testimonies to the contrary of like evidence that God does provide to people who are sincere. And so I think if we have to weigh the probabilities here, who's more likely to be mistaken? The person who thinks that they're not resistant, or the people who have these really difficult to explain, events happen to them? So in my mind, I think that it is easier to explain supposed non-resistant belief by cognitive dissonance or subconscious suppression than it is to explain some of these miracle claims, in my opinion, at least. So that's kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point, I think, with the tribe that nobody had ever visited them. Because on some level, the non-theist who's putting forward the argument from divine hiddenness, when they do appeal to these sort of obscure, off the beaten path tribes.
That tribe is only 400 people, by the way. It's not like it's
right, not some
people.
Massive thing. But the non-theist who's putting forth the argument from divine hiddenness, they're saying, well, look, these people can't have heard about the gospel, but why can't they have? Well, because there haven't been missionaries that have gone there. In other words, their presumption is that God's not going to do it directly. And so it's like, well, you can't on the one hand say, if God existed, then he would reach these people. But I'm also going to just presume that he hasn't, at the same time. And so that's kind of the point that I was making with Greg earlier, was like, if you think God really would reach those people, if he existed, and you have no reason to think that he hasn't reached those people, then it doesn't seem like you have a reason to think that they weren't reached. You know, it would just sort of be a presumption that they weren't reached because humans haven't been there. But your whole point is that if God exists, then he would somehow supernaturally do it.
Yeah, and he can, but I think in most cases he uses people because it's better than doing that. And I also think that what I might say, this will be one of the last things I say, so Kevin can go, and the other people. But this will depend on one's theology. Personally, I lean towards a universal reconciliation view of Christianity. And so I do think that there is such thing as post-mortem salvation. I think 1 Peter implies that, among other places. And so I would just say, well, even if people don't convert in this life, who's to say that they don't in the next? And so I think the idea of hiddenness then kind of crumbles. And we do have a little bit of evidence for this from near-death experiences. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole tangent of that, but assuming that some of these are legitimate, and there's reasons to think that, overwhelmingly the studies that look over these, people become much more religious and much more spiritual and closer to God, whichever religion they're in, after these experiences. And so if people really did experience part of the afterlife and come back and are more religious, and that I think that strongly implies that, the afterlife to a lot of these people is something that's meant to draw us closer to God. And so that would mean that this hiddenness would kind of be undermined once you're dead, that we would be able to have this relationship and it would no longer be this kind of hiddenness. And so maybe that's when we're ready. And so I would just say that saying that people saying that dying is a cutoff point is question begging, and that if it's true that they can do it post-mortem, then that really hurts the person's case as far as divine hiddenness goes. I think the burden would have to be on them to show that they can't do that even post, or at least it's unlikely that they could do this post-mortem, and that's a pretty heavy burden to reach, I think, and that's why I'd at least give arguments to say there's good evidence to think it's at least fairly probable. So that's kind of where I'll end it, but I don't know if you have any other comments.
Sure. Yeah. I'll go ahead and go to Kevin, but thanks for that. And if you have anything else, feel free to hop right back in the queue, and we'll go from there. All right. Kevin, guten Tag.
Guten Tag. Nice German there. I want to continue on the point that Greg started.
Okay.
Or I think he started it. About the first argument you presented.
Okay.
The first counter argument you presented. And I think this, if I understood you correctly, you say that people claim to have experience with God.
Yeah.
And so this whole divine hiddenness argument crumbles or something?
Yes. So basically the point was that the non-theist, when he's putting forth the argument from divine hiddenness, he's essentially, think of it like a courtroom. He wants to admit into evidence testimony from non-resistant non-believers, because that's basically why you think that there are these non-resistant non-believers, is essentially from testimony. Because if you never talk to them, then you have no idea whether God reveals himself directly to them or not. It's basically just this testimony or this experience of these people. And so if it's the case, if the rebuttal is, well, if you get to admit people who testify to non-resistant non-belief into testimony, well, then I get to admit into testimony, or into evidence, I should say, these people who testify, who are reasonable and sensible people who testify to firsthand experiences of God. And so, again, I don't make an argument generally from religious experience to God's existence. But in this case, if you're gonna admit an irreligious experience, then certainly it's not out of bounds for me to admit religious experience. And then in that case, there's a lot more people who have religious experience than irreligious, so the balance of the testimony would be in favor of the religious experience.
Okay, then I have to agree to Greg that this seems to be a misrepresentation of the argument of divine hiddenness, because what you ultimately do is survivorship bias. I linked it in the general chat, which is a form of selection bias, because you look at the wrong people. Like the argument of divine hiddenness is not about people who claim to have experience with God, it's about the people who don't have. So we need to look at that set of people and not at the people who claim to have. So this,
right.
We have people. Yeah. So
the point was that I realize that the divine hiddenness argument is about people who claim non-resistant non-belief. or at least what I'm saying is the when you ask the critic who's putting forth that argument, you're saying that there are people who are non-resistant non-believers. How do you justify that premise? Generally, the way they're going to justify that premise is by admitting testimony. That's what they're going to rely on, is testimony. Because you can't rely on, I never met some aborigine in the middle of nowhere. I'm just going to assume that God never revealed himself to him. Like, that's not going to work, right? So you have to have actual testimony, and so that's what would be admitted into evidence. So I realize that the argument from divine hiddenness is essentially indirectly about the testimony of non-resistant non-believers. My point is, well, if you're going to consider non-resistant non-believers and your conclusion is that therefore God doesn't exist, well, that means that this other class of testimony, people who claim to have religious experience, you have to throw that out. So essentially, the argument from divine hiddenness pits these two different classes of testimony towards each other. You can't accept both. I suppose you could reject both, but you certainly can't accept both. You can't accept non-resistant non-belief and religious experience as vertical. Like, one of them has to be incorrect. And so my point is, well, look, if the divine hidden argument really does work, and it really does show that there's a conflict that you have to throw out one class of testimony, well, the class of testimony from religious experience is just much, much bigger. There's a lot more testimony. And so its evidentiary power would be greater because there's just a lot more people testifying to that. And that's what I was getting at in the beginning. If you're a journalist covering a parade and you've got 25 people who say, yeah, my favorite float was the giant peacock, it was beautiful. You got 25 people saying that, and you got 5 people saying, I didn't see a peacock and I was right up front. There was no peacock. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to probably believe, okay, well, 25 people saw the peacock. I don't know what's going on with the 5. 25 people saw the peacock, so I'm going to go with the 25 people. And that's kind of the point that I was making, is divine hiddenness pits these two classes of testimony towards each other, and it's reasonable to go with the larger group of witnesses, and if there is that sort of conflict.
The problem is the peacock isn't omniscient, it's not omnipotent, it's not, it doesn't want a relationship with you. But that's the problem of the divine hiddenness.
Yeah. So the analogy with the journalist and the float isn't between the peacock and God. The analogy is between having a large body of witnesses who testify to this thing, and to have a smaller body of witnesses with a conflicting or contradictory testimony. So which are you going to accept? The larger number of witnesses or the smaller number of witnesses? Because that's essentially what it comes down to.
Yeah, but again, this is a misrepresentation of the argument. The argument starts with, this is what a God should, if we grant the attributes, a God would reach out to people. But we have people that are not believing, that didn't have contact to a God, therefore. So what you do is you make a completely different argument. That's not you straw man.
So let me just ask you this then. It's premise, I think, 5. Some human persons are non-resistantly unaware that God exists. That's the premise. How would you justify that premise?
I need to find it again. 1 second.
Yeah, it's premise 5.
Anyways,
some human persons are non-resistantly unaware that God exists. So how would you justify that premise?
You can just find the person who is non-resistantly unaware of that God exists.
Well, how would you know though that they're unaware? I mean, is it like written on their skin? Is it? How do you know that they're non-resistant non-believers? I mean, you can't tell by their haircut, right? So how do you know?
How do you know that people who claim that they have had experience with a God actually had experience with a God?
No, you said that you find people who are non-resistantly unaware that God exists. But how would you know that they're unless they tell you? How would you know that they're non-resistantly unaware? It feels like you're going to have to rely on them telling you. There's not some other way for you to know.
So we have to think that they are lying to not be in this set of people.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not accusing them of lying. At this point, I'm not even saying that they're wrong. I'm just asking, how do you know? How do you know that there are these people? I'm not challenging. What I'm trying to bring up is, what I'm trying to show is that you're basically relying on their testimony. That's what you have to, right? I mean, there's no other way to know what they think unless they tell you. Right? So
So we are comparing psychological states with claims about a god now? Or?
No, I'm at... Well, how do you know they have that psychological state of non-resistant unawareness?
I don't know, look in their brains.
Look in their brains?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think anybody's done that. So if that's the case, then yeah, it's completely unjustified because we've never looked in somebody's brain and found non-resistant unawareness. I mean, it seems to me like the way that you would find out that they're non-resistantly unaware is that they would testify about their experience. You would have to have them tell you. At least to this point, we haven't looked in their brain. So I'll at least, if we somehow could, okay, but then we don't have that evidence because we haven't looked in their brains yet. And so it seems like you're going to have to rely on them telling you, right? I mean, how else would you know what they're thinking?
I'm just thinking that there are gods that I am resistant towards, and I'm aware that there are claims that this god exists.
Right, but I can't know that about you unless you tell me.
Yeah, but then this argument still works with me, right?
Well, I don't know, but I mean, we're not even get to that point yet. I'm just trying to find out, how do you know that there are? Because my case was based off of it being testimony just to justify this premise, and you're objecting to that and saying, well, no, that's a mischaracterization of the argument, because the only way that could be a mischaracterization of the argument is if the argument doesn't rely on testimony to justify this premise. And so, if it's not testimony, then what is it?
The thing is, you don't need to find the argument convincing for it to be correct. So if there is a person that actually fits this description, but he tells you this and you don't believe it because it's testimony, the argument would still work because the person still fits the description.
Okay, well then we wouldn't know the argument's valid then, because essentially what you're saying is, well, we've got no reason to believe
it's valid, but it would still work.
No, it wouldn't work.
It would still be correct.
If it's got premises that are not true, then if it's got premises that we can't believe, then we can't believe the argument, right? I mean, how do we get to the conclusion if we don't agree with the premises?
The premise would be correct, but we wouldn't know if it's correct. That's the point.
Okay, well, in that case, we can't know if the conclusion's correct, right? And so we wouldn't be justified in accepting the conclusion if we're not justified in accepting the premises.
The conclusion would still be valid, and and assuming the premise is correct, or there is a truth value behind this premise.
Sure. Yeah, I'll grant that it's either true or false. I'll certainly grant that. But my point is, if you've got no reason to think it's true, then you've got no reason to accept the conclusion that follows from it, right?
It's not about accepting it, it's that the whole argument still has a truth value. So it doesn't matter if you accept it or not.
Okay.
If the fifth premise has a truth value that is true, then the argument works.
Okay, well, again, I mean, I guess I don't know what you mean by works, because if we can't trust the conclusion, if we're not justified in accepting the conclusion, then I don't know what it means by works, how the argument works. But I'll give you the last word, and then I'm going to go to the next person in the queue, which is J-Buff.
I don't have a lot of last words, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Good evening, I need to sleep.
All right. Well, thanks, Kevin. All right, J-Buff, I've got a... should have gone through. Oh, there you are.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you just fine.
All right, awesome. Well, yeah. So I actually mentioned in the sort of general tab a while
Oh,
back that actually
sorry.
divine hiddenness. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I didn't see it. If you just post, oh, earlier you posted it like
Oh,
a
no, no,
week
no,
or.
no. This is yeah. This is a long time ago.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I had mentioned that divine hiddenness was one of the major reasons why I'm not personally a believer.
Okay.
And and honestly, I would say that that's just based on, like you said, personal testimony. I mean, to be frank with you, I don't think that Schellenberg's version of the argument is even a sound deductive argument. So yeah, I mean, I for the same reasons that a believer, and that's why I don't discount really even a believer's personal testimony and experience, because in the same way that they have experience with God, and a lot of times that can, for them, justify their belief in God. That kind of has the same sort of effect for me. But I did have just one. This is more of a question, sort of a challenging question, but also, just curious what your thoughts on this is.
Okay.
So
I am really curious about what you've just said. I don't know if you're going to clarify it more, but you said you don't think it's a sound argument, but it is why you are not a Christian.
Well, it's not. Yeah. To clarify the argument, like Schellenberg's argument here, I don't find it deductively sound in the sense that. So when I say that it's a big reason why I'm not a believer. It's not his argument is the reason why I'm not a believer. It's the fact that I don't have a lot of. It's in my direct experience. I don't have any experience with this God, so I can't really have a relationship with something I can't access. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I would think
it's and just to clarify, it's not that I think that my experience leads to the conclusion necessarily that God doesn't exist, which is why I don't find it a deductive sound argument. But it's just kind of like you mentioned, obviously I and I think a lot of people would consider themselves non-resistant non-believers. And like you said, there may be reasons for this God to not reveal himself to me and to others. And so I'm perfectly fine with that. But until that happens, I don't really have much to work with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what I would say then is it may be worthwhile to reflect on your evidentiary standards and to see if there's something there that's preventing you from accepting the conclusion of various arguments for God's existence. Or honestly, it could just be introspection. I mean, like I said earlier, if somebody thinks that they're a good person, generally speaking, we would expect that God might not reveal himself to them because that belief that they're good, that false belief that they're a good person, could very well lead to not relating well to God. And so in that case, and honestly, like whether you believe in God or not, I think introspection is a good thing.
Sure.
And so I think it's worthwhile examining, like, okay, what does it mean to be a good person, and why do I think I am one? If that's the case, I don't know if you think you're a good person or not. But that's what I would say is like what to work with. Well, it doesn't have to be, the end that you work with, right? So if you're building a tank, I don't know why a tank is the first thing that comes to mind. If you're building a tank, you don't start with the tank. Right, you start with metal that you got to melt down and you got to shape it and all this, and so you don't start with a conclusion. You start like with what you've got, and at least what you do have is the ability to be introspective.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. I mean, I can tell you. Just give you a little background too. I mean, me personally, I started off a Christian for the first, I want to say 23, 24 years of my life. And was even a preacher at one point too.
Oh.
So I used to go to different churches and preach. And without, obviously I'm not going to hijack this with my personal story, but essentially, I mean, I at some point the evidence became a little bit insufficient for me.
Okay.
That's a discussion for another day. But essentially, I think for me, as of right now, I think that the biggest thing with relation to the divine hiddenness argument, actually, when it comes to my own personal journey, is I feel like the reality of hell and the reality of an eternal, just an eternal place of torment, for me, should, in my mind, give God every reason to try to save as many people as possible through as as to any degree that he has to go to save those people. I think that he should, if that makes sense. So like you mentioned that if you don't have like there's a possibility that you could be someone who thinks they're a good person, and so maybe they're not in need of or they wouldn't have this sort of relationship that God would want to have with them. And in my mind, it's like the priority is saving these people, right? The priority isn't necessarily, I mean, it would be great. It's ideal if we could have a great relationship, if me and God could also have a great relationship as well. But it seems like the priority, given the urgency of eternal torment, should be to save them by any means possible, which could include even things like, scaring someone into the faith. Like for me, it would be analogous almost to a child, kind of on the street and in the path of a truck. If the only means of getting that child off of the road is to scare them off of the road, I would do so, because I think that would be the only compassionate thing to do.
What I would say to that is that I think that it fundamentally misunderstands the project of Christianity and what God's goal is. A lot of Christians and definitely theologians would say that it is impossible to scare somebody into faith, because faith is trust. And so if my reason for believing in you and following you is so that you don't hit me, then it isn't the case that I came to you in faith and trust. It's the case that I ran from something else. And so it's when I say that they're not relating to God properly, I don't mean that they have like a copacetic relationship. I'm not talking about like the emotive part of it. What I'm talking about is that they don't relate to God in a way that leads to them being saved. And so, for example, if somebody believes that they're a good person, then becoming aware of God's existence could lead to religious pride. And somebody who's religiously proud, they're going to hell probably. I mean, yeah, no, they are. They're going to hell. If they think they're a good person because, they do these good things and their faith is in, essentially in themselves, then they can say they trust God. And the Pharisees that Jesus interacted with said they trusted God. But no, they don't. They went to hell. They were, the children of Satan is the way Jesus referred to them. And so in that case, it isn't the case that belief in God is better for them. It would actually be better for them to at least have plausible deniability. And so a person like that, it's not the case that God is helping them by revealing himself. He may actually be hurting them. And so it would be like trying to save the child by, say a car is bearing down. Well, maybe they survived getting hit by the car, but instead you push them in front of a train, right? So like it's way worse, because you intervened. And so like that, and that may be the case that for some people.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to say, I'd love to push back on that just a little bit, which is, when I talk about, and I'm using sort of this flippant phrase of like scaring people into Christianity, but I mean, there's obviously a more nuanced way to look at it as just God, using. He has a lot of tools at his disposal, right? So he could use fear as a tool to lead to a person's change of heart, and I do think that I think we do see examples of that in Scripture. I think that Paul is actually a great example of that. Someone who was very adamantly opposed to Christ, and yet, it seems that one of the ways in which God used to convert Paul was through fear, and at least initially. I mean, obviously, the whole relationship wasn't based around fear, but it seems to me that when Paul first met Jesus, I mean, we read in Acts about how Paul was trembling. And obviously Jesus startled him, just kind of came out of nowhere, blinded the man for several days. Like, I mean, there were tactics of fear and intimidation used in that. And I don't think that's wrong. I think that sometimes fear can be a very useful actually method to at least initiate the change that could lead to trust and to love and to faith,
Certainly.
So I do think that we see examples of that.
And that certainly could be the case. But then the pushback would be like, Number one, it needn't be the case that everybody would respond well, and that's really all that's necessary to work as a rebuttal against the argument, is to say that that there could be people for whom that would not work. And so if there could be people for whom that would not work, then there could be people for whom God would not do that. And even though God's perfectly loving, and the claim is that God's, a perfectly loving God is incompatible with the existence of such people. But if we've shown how such people could exist, and yet God is still perfectly loving, then we've diffused the argument, because that premise is now false. We've shown that it's perfectly consistent with a perfectly loving God for there to be non-resistant unbelievers, because it may be the case that that there are people who scaring wouldn't do. And in fact, if you really believe the argument, then what you would believe is that if there is that for anybody who would respond positively to that, God does scare them into the faith, and so it could just as easily be that. And so and I think we do see that in Acts 17. I happen to be Molinist. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but in Acts 17 it says that God so ordered the world that He put people in times and at places. He essentially directed where people would be born, when they would be born. He ordered the world in that way so that people would come to Him. In other words, nobody is lost because of some accident of geography, right? Because God ordained the world or arranged the world in such a way that people who would respond positively to the faith are in circumstances where they do respond positively to the faith, where they receive that gospel message, and that's that's strongly implied by the book of Acts. And so you think that again, like if you think that there are things that God would do, well, there are people who come to faith because they were scared by near-death experiences. In fact, I was just seeing this YouTube video of a guy who said that, yeah, he had a near-death experience and he went to hell, and it scared the crap out of him. He came back to life and came back to his body, or whatever you would say it, and now he's a Christian. And so, yeah, there could certainly be the case that God does scare those people who would respond well to being, by well, I mean respond appropriately to being scared. But I'll let you have the last word, and then Greg's in line.
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate that. I think to go back to something you said earlier, I think I would agree with you that so long as there are some people who, scaring into the faith would not work.
Yeah.
I think that would diffuse the argument, which is like I said, there's a major reason why I don't think that the argument is deductively sound. But in my mind, there is this aspect of, like I said before, that if God does want people to obviously avoid the eternal torment, He would do that for as many people as possible, right? And so, like you said, it's possible that He's done that for everybody.
Yeah.
That can be done for. But like I said, from my own personal testimony and personal experience, there have been several times in my life when I've almost been scared back into Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that for myself personally, I can't convince you of this or anybody else of this, of course, but I know that for myself personally, there are things that I can imagine God doing to scare me almost back into the faith, or just, like I said, in the more nuanced way of saying it, using fear as a way to bring me back into the faith. And since that hasn't been happening, that's why I remain where I am. So until that happens, who knows? I still got some time in my life, so who knows? Maybe He'll do that. But as of right now, that's where I'm at.
Sure. Well, if you don't mind, I'll just give you kind of like my personal experience, because it sounds very similar to yours. And I hope Greg won't begrudge me this, but so I also had a deconversion experience. When I was 17, I abandoned the faith, turned away from God, became an atheist actually, for several years. And I remember praying basically like, okay, God, if you're there. I had this friend from high school, we were really close friends. But after high school, it's as people do, they go their own ways. And he had gone in a direction where like, there's just no intersection between my life and his. Like there's just no intersection between my life and his. And I said, all right, well, God, he was a Christian. And I said, all right, God, if you do exist and if you believe, then put me back in touch with Him. Send Him for me, and I'll believe, because, there's no way that I would, without you intervening, there's just no way that I'm going to have any interaction with this guy again. And nothing happened for years. Nothing happened. And then later, after a few years, Basically, circumstances in my life had devolved, and I was to the point where I was thinking I was going to lose my job, I was going to lose my my place I was living at, and I finally came to the point where I was like, all right, God, the direction my life's going, I'm not. I thought I could lead my own life and everything was going to be hunky dory, but it's not. So if you'll just show me that that you'll forgive me or something like that, then I'll believe you. And I had completely forgotten about this guy. I just could be out of my because I hadn't seen him in years and I hadn't thought about him. When it came to that point where I was at a place where I was like, okay, God, I need you. I've messed up my life. I'm going in a direction that's bad. I need you. And I came to a place in my heart where I would respond positively. And within a couple of days, the guy reached out to me. Now, look, you can say that's coincidence. Sure, yeah, could be. But at least for me, the reason, looking back at that, at the time when I first gave that challenge to God, I think it wouldn't have been good for me to have met the guy. Because where I was at in my heart, in my head, I would not have responded positively to it. But I only know that now on the other side. And when finally my life came to the point where I was actually in a place where I would respond positively to God, that's when I encountered him. So maybe that's kind of where you're at. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, the last thing I'll say too, before Greg comes on. Yeah, I mean, my dad says all the time. He's like, because my dad is like a very fervent Christian still.
Sure.
So, he's very much like, oh, like I'm just waiting for the day, when you'll come back and everything like that. And I always tell him the same thing every time he says that, which is, I'm never going to say that could never happen. Obviously,
sure.
Because anything could happen. God could be real, and he'll show me tomorrow.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can only operate obviously from where I'm at right now. So until that happens, I'll be waiting.
All right.
But yeah, appreciate it, Matt.
Sounds good. Thanks, J-Buff. All right, Greg, I got an invite out to you. Sorry for the delay there. I hope you didn't mind me going on a tangent about.
No worries.
Yeah.
No worries. Yeah. I'd also like to second. Sorry, it was J-Buff, right?
J-Buff sent him apparently, so he's actually not J-Buff. J-Buff sent him. So I just call him J-Buff.
Anyway, the point about being open. But I guess let's see. I wanted to respond to a few things that primarily you and C. Jackson said earlier. The first is I do think even Schellenberg's presentation of the argument is legitimate, even though I'll admit that there's a solid counter-argument to it that C. Jackson mentioned, which is universalism, which is that, if people who have died without having heard of Christianity still have a chance to be saved, then, we can no longer say that there exist non-resistant non-believers because perhaps they will become believers later.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do think that if you have someone who is currently a non-believer, divine hiddenness can stay a good argument for them to against Christianity because under the logic that perhaps, if Jesus is real, I needn't worry about converting during life because, perhaps I will be converted later, perhaps I'll be saved later. And I know there are plenty of other considerations there, but that's, I just wanted to acknowledge first that I think universalism is a kind of good reply.
Yeah.
There's two more points I want to make. The first is, you bring up, I think, pretty much correctly. Well, you brought up that to know that non-resistant non-believers exist, we need their testimony. We need to believe them when they say, "Oh, I'm a non-resistant non-believer," and I don't think that's quite correct.
Okay.
Because if there are
which part that we have to believe them, or that we have to have their testimony to know that they identify as such?
I think the first.
Okay.
Because if if we know that Christianity was only introduced to a specific culture at a specific time, and we know that that culture has existed far before that time, then I think it's, we can kind of infer that those who've already died had not heard of Christianity, because, or at the very least hadn't been saved, I suppose, because presumably they would have mentioned it.
So we can't infer that. So it is true in Christianity that you don't have to have ever heard of Jesus to be saved. There's this whole Old Testament full of people who are redeemed, never heard of Jesus. And the New Testament said, basically there's this teaching, and I forget exactly where it is, I'm sure Jackson knows where it is, where it says that God was shown to be righteous for passing over their sins because of Jesus. In other words, God didn't punish those people. And so how is it that God's perfectly just if he's like, here are these bunch of sinners and you're not doing anything about it? And he was shown to be righteous because Jesus, because of the atonement. In other words, God took their correct response to the revelation that they had received, and he counted that as faith in him. And then on the basis of that imputed Christ's sacrifice and his righteousness to them. And that's why I brought up Job as an example. Job is a person who is a random guy. He's an Edomite. He's not a Jew. He didn't have any sort of scriptures at all. But nonetheless, he responded appropriately to the revelation that he had received. And I mean, it doesn't definitively say that he's saved, but if you look at just the way the story goes, he's represented as a righteous person who found righteousness in God's sight. And so I think that the thrust of Job is that Job is saved, and he would be one of those people where the message of Christ hadn't reached wouldn't reach his people group for centuries and centuries and centuries.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to dwell on this too long because I do want to get to my third point. Okay. But my response to that, I think 2, maybe 3 responses. That's like, I would count that as almost a restatement of universalism, or at least a weaker version, in that it has less scope, not that it's less strong argument. And just because it's pointing out ways that somebody doesn't need to hear of Christ in order to be saved, and I think there's that does start to poke some holes, like why evangelism then would probably be wrong, just because you're all of a sudden making a bunch of people culpable. And the second point, I can't remember.
I would disagree with that, but I don't know if you want to just move on or.
No, I'll hear you out.
Okay. So the point is that these are people who respond positively to the revelation that they receive. If somebody, it seems very reasonable to think that if they're the person who would respond positively to the revelation that they receive, then if they receive the gospel, they would respond positively to that. And so we wouldn't expect it's at least reasonable to believe that. And then again, back to Acts, where it says that God ordered the world so that people would seek him and perhaps find him. So it may very well be the case that God, if somebody truly would not believe if they accepted the gospel, then it could be the case that God hides the gospel from them so that they're therefore not culpable.
My third point, I guess, is in a sense response to that, which is I think it's false. Like, and I mean, you that's no surprise, but I think we can tell that it's false because there are,
tell that what's false.
How many, I think empirically we can see that there are people who, would accept Christ under certain conditions because there are people who are, devoutly devoted, sorry, that's redundant, who are devoted to God and love God, but, just happened to have been born in a non-Christian but still theist culture. I'm thinking of the, how many Muslims are there? 1.6 billion
Oh, I'm
Muslims.
not sure.
Like
A lot.
and like so many of these people are passionate and devoted and really love Allah or love God, their concept of God. And it's like, this, so the idea that, touching on the earlier point that, oh, maybe God would hide from somebody whose heart wasn't open, these people, their heart is open to Christ, because their heart is open to God. They, if God came down in a way, if God came down and contacted them, to say, by the way, I have this son named Jesus, like, somebody who loved God would, I think, would be receptive to that. Like, I don't think this ordering of the worlds, I just think it's, empirically false in a sense.
So I guess my pushback there would be that one of the things that I've been struck as I've studied missionary work in seminary and all that, is that Muslims in particular, for whatever reason, they have, as a people group, far more personal experiences of God, as in visions, revelations, dreams, things than any other group. You don't see Europeans saying this. But for whatever reason, Muslims, that's a big way that a lot of Muslims come to faith is they have these sorts of visions and dreams. So, if the point is, well, look, there are these devout Muslims who would respond positively to the faith. Okay, well, then my pushback would be, yeah, and a lot of them, we see a lot of Muslims who are devout, who are having these experiences and coming to the faith. And so, again, I don't think that, like, it's not something I would give you for free. You'd have to show me. I'm not going to just say, yeah, there's so many Muslims. Okay, yeah, I'll just agree that some of them would respond positively to the faith if they receive it, and that they don't receive it, and that they're ultimately damned. Like, I wouldn't grant you all of that. And so, you'd have to show that. And then the other point that I would make is that Islam in particular is a works-based religion. And so when people are devout to a works-based religion, they're working for their own salvation. And so it's like, yes, you're devout, but you're not really devout to God. You're devout towards your own end of being redeemed. That you hope to go to heaven and have all of the various experiences described in the Quran for people who get to go there. And so if you're just doing it for those rewards, it's not clear to me that counts as being devout and open to God.
The only thing that my argument requires is that the number of Muslims who are devoted and open to God is greater than the number of Christian ex-Muslims. And there's because yes, there have been plenty of Muslims who've converted to Christianity.
Well, if I could push back on that, it can't just be that they're open to God. It has to be that they would respond positively to revelation if they received it, because they can be open to Allah because that's the religion that they want to pursue, but not be a person who would respond positively. That is, with faith in Jesus for salvation. To revelation if they received it. So it wouldn't be enough to say that they're open to God. It would have to be that they would respond positively to revelation if they received it.
See, to me, that's largely what I meant by open to God, in that, if they recognize the revelation as from God, which it really doesn't take much to make someone think that what they're experiencing is a revelation from God, then, they would recognize, oh, this is God. That's once they recognize that, if they, given that they do love God, as a matter of fact, as a matter of their mental state. Anyway, sorry.
Well, like I said at the beginning, when it comes to an internal challenge to the consistency of Christianity, I can rely on the resources of Christianity to respond to it. It's perfectly legitimate for me to do that. And we find in Acts 17 where it says that God so ordered the world that people are born at times and places where they would seek him out and find him. And so, that is addressed in scriptures, and it says that God orders the world so that people like the ones you're describing do have an experience of God and do receive the gospel and respond positively to it. And so, I guess I'm not going to just assume that, well, there must be some.
I would just, I would just call that a false prediction.
What's that?
A prediction made by Christianity.
You're saying it's a false prediction, but you can't show what somebody would do if they have if they had an experience that they haven't had. I mean, how would you show that counterfactual to be the case?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, you can't. There's no counterfactual. I suppose can be proven.
Definitely not empirically demonstrated, right? Because it's a counterfactual.
Yeah, I just think that it's based on. I guess based on these people's character. I guess the other thing, and probably the more rigorous response, besides just that it's unbelievable that these, millions of people who care so much are, none of them are positively receptive. The more rigorous response would probably be that answer, the rebuttal in Acts presupposes determinism, Molinism, some kind of ism that you could
Molinism, yeah.
Mind. But which I still need to read more about. But I guess the point is, and it's not just Muslims, but there are, the reason I did want to bring up the parallel to theodicy, which I believe C. Jackson brought up, I think, where if you grant that there are certain kind of good reasons for God not to intervene and prevent various examples of sin, evil, or suffering, because there are goods that can come about, or the theodicy that I consider legitimate is, the free will theodicy. C for, planning as free will defense, etc. And I guess one other thing I wanted to bring up is that God giving someone a revelation does not violate their free will.
Correct.
For someone to experience, to have a sensory experience doesn't violate their free will. So that, what I consider the good reason God would have to allow evil does not prevent God from giving everyone a revelation. I do think the point you brought up, Matt, about a revelation can hurt someone's relationship with God in certain points is an interesting one. But I still do think, I guess going back to my second point and then I'll be done, that's people who have lived and died without having heard of Christianity, unless you allow that they're contacted in the afterlife, I think it's, implausible to think that their relationship with God would be harmed by actually being contacted or hearing of God.
I mean, if they are saved after they die, then I don't think. I guess I don't see the challenge there.
Yeah, no, I was saying if they are saved after they die, then that that I consider that a good response that does defeat divine hiddenness, as I said at the beginning.
Okay. But, I mean, I can just tell you that Christianity has always accepted that there are people who have never heard of Jesus and yet will be saved. Because we've never thought that people like Moses are going to hell and Abraham's going to hell. We never thought that. And so it's always been the case that there are circumstances in which somebody would never hear the gospel and yet still be saved.
Gotcha.
But yeah, thanks. If you have any other thoughts, then I'll go to J-Buff.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right, and this will be the kind of the last interaction because we're going on time here. J-Buff, Pastor J-Buff.
Yeah.
So we have to settle this.
Former.
So J Buff sent you, or you are J Buff? That's the.
Oh no, yeah, no, I'm not J Buff. No,
Oh, okay.
I wasn't sent to this particular. I don't know. I'm not familiar with Discord. Like I wasn't sent to this particular
Server.
I don't know group or whatever. It was something completely different.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe
Anyway,
you said you were a pastor. Maybe it was like a new religion, like the J Buffian. And J Buff sent you. You're the prophet of J Buff.
Yeah, he would love that. Though.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I realized that in my last interaction, I didn't actually get to ask the question that I wanted to ask, which
Sure.
is, I suppose I just want to ask, is there any, for you, is there any lack of interaction from God that would cause you to doubt, not his existence, because obviously you could still fall back on arguments from fine tuning and the Kalam and all those things, but that would make you doubt that he's a personal God who cares to interact with us? Like, is there any level of interaction or the lack thereof that would cause you to think that maybe he's not involved? Like maybe he's nothing more than a deistic God, for example.
No, in fact, quite the opposite. I've had a couple of interactions with God, and I would be very satisfied to not have one again until after I die. It's a terrifying experience. And you see that in Scripture. People react to it differently. It freaked me out. I'm happy to just read the Bible and pray and have kind of like my immediate awareness of God, but not have him speak to me would be great. In fact, I think that it's loving me well by allowing that distance, so that I'm not terrified by him.
Yeah, I realize I probably phrased that question not in the best way. But I think in fact, let's put it this way: like, suppose God had absolutely no interaction with his creation at all, besides creating it and then leaving it to its own devices. So he doesn't speak to us, doesn't perform miracles, doesn't appear or guide us or anything like that. He doesn't interact in any way whatsoever. Would you then say that someone would be justified in doubting whether or not that God is a personal being that's eager for a relationship with us?
I don't. You're describing a world that's very different than the current world.
Sure.
I mean, because the thing is, like, I think from natural theology, you can get to God's desire and intention towards creation, because the fine tuning argument implies a designer implies intention, and so to say that God created the world but then didn't have intentions towards it, it's kind of like saying that God both intended and didn't intend the world. And so I think that I don't think that because of fine tuning, I don't think you would be justified in saying that God didn't have intentions for the world. And then based off of the moral argument, if God is maximally good, then I don't think that it would ever be the case that he, it has intentions, sees us in our plight, sees us in our need, and then just doesn't care. That seems inconsistent with a morally perfect being. So, essentially, I think you're describing a possible that's not actually possible, because I think it would entail certain contradictions. Things like God both intends and doesn't intend the world, and God is both, all loving and also not all loving. And so it'd be hard for me to describe what people would or wouldn't be justified in believing in a world like that, because it's contradictory. It's hard to say what would be entailed there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess to sort of add on to it, I wasn't necessarily specifying that God had, and I guess maybe I did, but I'll probably take that back. I wasn't specifying necessarily that God has no interaction with any part of his creation at all. But because you could obviously imagine, on some other world somewhere there are creatures that are intelligent and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But perhaps God doesn't interact with them. For whatever reason, perhaps because they don't have a soul or something, there may be some reason why he doesn't interact. And it just made me think, would they be justified, would those creatures be justified in thinking that, okay, if there is a God, based on the creation of the universe and everything, he doesn't seem particularly interested in us, And I guess, and the only reason I'm asking, I think I'm more so just getting at if there's any way for us for us basically to distinguish a God that's personal and loving and wants relationship with us from one that is just deistic and doesn't do much at all. Because God could be a personal being. I assume God could be a personal being and loving and all those things without interacting with anybody. Because he doesn't, even if we were fallen creatures and everything, I mean, he doesn't have to save us. Like, that's one of the tenets of Christianity, is that salvation is a gift, through mercy, not because we deserve it. You understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, so I don't think that God has to save us in the sense that God's not obligated to save us, but I do think that if God is the moral foundation for moral virtues such as mercy, then God is perfectly merciful. And so his nature entails that he will seek to offer mercy. And so I don't think that, I don't think that it would be consistent with a morally perfect God to refuse to entertain mercy or that sort of thing. But I mean, again, to try to answer like the question I think you're trying to get at, I do think it's consistent with the existence of a perfectly loving God to allow people to disbelieve, to hide himself. That was kind of one of the responses that I gave to divine hiddenness, was to say it could be the case that God hides himself from people because they would respond poor. When I say poorly, they would respond without faith in Jesus to God's revelation of himself. They would respond in some other way that then makes them culpable. For not just culpable for their actual sins, but then also now culpable for having rejected this essentially offer of pardon. And so I don't think it's inconsistent with a perfectly loving God to hide himself from people under certain circumstances. And so for that reason, no, I don't think that the fact of such people, if that is a fact, I don't think that that's a challenge to God's existence, because I think it's perfectly consistent with God.
Awesome. Oh, thank you.
Fair enough. All right, thanks. Well, hey, thanks guys for dropping by. Appreciate talking to you, and I hope you have a great evening.